We'll start session 1 of the DMZ Global Forum 2021. We have Dr. Park Jung-won, Director of the Korea Future Institute, will be moderating the session. Nice to meet you all. My name is Park Jung-won. I'm teaching in the law school of Kookmin University. So in this session, we'll discuss laws and systems regarding the DMZ. So yesterday, I visited the Tutayan Valley and looked at a lot of wild plants and really experienced the ecosystem and the environment of the DMZ and the border area. I really hope that this pristine nature can be enjoyed by both South and North Koreans. So now we'll start session 1. So it's been 1 year since the Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation Act was revised. And with that revision, local governments are now allowed to implement inter-Korean cooperation. So in addition to the initiatives led by the Ministry of Unification, local governments, including the Yanggu County, can now implement inter-Korean cooperation. That's why today's forum is organized by both the Ministry and the Yanggu County. So in the morning session, we talked broadly about cooperation in the DMZ in the climate change era. And in this session, we will talk in a more detail about the legal and institutional framework regarding the DMZ. Now, there is the lack of institutionalization and legal frameworks regarding the DMZ. There are many practical challenges regarding implementing an initiative in the DMZ. And with the current laws and institutions, it's difficult to find ways to overcome that. Now, this is not just an issue for the DMZ itself or an issue of domestic jurisdiction, but also related to international legal arrangements. So we will discuss this issue with 3 speakers and 2 panelists. Let me first introduce the speakers. First, we have Assistant Professor Han Monica at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies of the Seoul National University. We also have Professor Kim Kwang-soo, teaching in the Law School of Seogang University. We also have Mr. Lee Hyung-chul, a partner of Logos Law. So we'll discuss issues related to the UN Forces Command, and domestic and international legal issues regarding the utilization and conservation of the DMZ, and also about more specific legislative issues regarding the use and conservation of the DMZ. And we also have 2 panelists, Team Leader Ryu Ji-sung of the National Unification Legislation Team of the Korean Legislation Research Institute, who will join us online, and Director Kim Ino of the Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation Office. I will give each speaker 18 minutes and each discussion panelist about 8 minutes. And after the discussion, I will ask the speakers to give 2 to 3 minute answer each, and then make closing comments. First, I'd like to invite Professor Han.
Yes, good afternoon. As introduced, I'm Han Monica from Seoul National University. I'm really honored to be invited as one of the presenters at this important forum. And this session, as our chair has said, we are talking about laws and regulations of DMZ, identifying issues related to that, and how to revamp them. So it's about pulling our wisdom together to revise them in the more desirable direction. So we had the law regarding the turning the DMZ into a peace zone that's been put forward at the National Assembly, and I believe that's currently going through amendment process. So new law in creating new laws and regulations governing DMZ, I do believe the first things that we need to think about is the various laws and regulations that govern DMZ, existing ones, and we need to review them. So the DMZ's actual governing law is the UNC regulation. Armistice agreement have been really studied and discussed a lot, but not only the armistice agreement, but the application of that or implementation of that armistice agreement is done through the UNC regulation. So in what perspective does the UNC regulations govern the DMZ area, and why that needs to be revised is also what I want to share with you. So first, the UNC regulations, I'm going to tell you about its background and why it's a problem, and what are its regulation characteristics, and what are the issues related to regulation on the access control on the DMZ, and also about how the militarization of DMZ was actually is because many of the regulations or articles of the amnesty agreement are no longer effective, and that actually results in violation of the amnesty agreement. So the core text of the amnesty agreement are no longer valid, but the only thing that is currently that is still very important and valid and effective clauses do exist, and based on that, the access control to DMZ is done through the UN command. Of course, UN Forces Command are very faithful in supporting inter-Korean dialogues, and they actually do actively PRs about that. But when it comes to access control, the DNZ area and constraints that comes with it, a lot of Koreans are frustrated about this. And in 2019, I actually took 3 examples. There were a series of events that showed us clearly that access control to DMZ and the authority of UN forces command over it do have some cause for concern. And another thing why I looked into this is changes in the environment. Armistice agreement was done in 1953, and it's been 70 years ago. So for 70 years, while that time passed, Korean society has changed and inter-Korean relationship have changed, as well as the political situation around Korean Peninsula has also changed. When the Armistice Agreement was first signed, the focus was to prevent recurrence of war on Korean Peninsula. That was the top priority in signing the agreement. But now, going beyond the Armistice Agreement, how to create new peace in DMZ and how to spread that to Korean Peninsula and to the world have become very important. Given such changes in geopolitical situation, changes in the people thinking, can the DMZ still be governed by the Armistice Agreement? It has become very doubtful. And for active peacemaking, a new law governing DMZ probably is needed. And these questions more to evolve them or spread them more actively, we first need to look at how the Armistice Agreement is actually being executed and implemented, and through which means and tools are they being executed, and then maybe even think about revising the UN command regulations. So as you can see here as a diagram shows that the Armistice Agreement directly has become the governing law for the DMZ, but it's done through the UNC regulations. That is the means, and I tried to draw that up. Now, then UNC regulations, I mean, there are different regulations there, but when it pertains to DMZ, the ones that are directly involved, there are 4 articles. Of course, in other articles and clauses, DMZ are mentioned. So as you can see, the basic UNC regulation is 551-4, and it always talks about military operations, and this 551-4 is for complying with the Armistice Agreement. What is interesting is that in the application period of the UNC regulation is the time that is recognized by the UN command. So in the Armistice Agreement, it says until the peace is achieved, but in the UN regulation, the key is period recognized by the UN command and chief, and that it's applicable to everyone involved in this area. And 551-5 talks about the security tour of the Armistice Commission. And in other articles, it also talks about security tour. So Ulchi Observatory and other underground tunnels are governed as part of the security tour mentioned and here. And other clauses relates to governing administration of the Daesung area, which is close to DMZ. So once the like armistice agreement, once it's stipulated, uh, um, it doesn't change. It's not like that. The UN SIG regulations were updated and amended based on needs throughout the years. And for 551-4, it's been amended by at least 6 times. And what is interesting is by 2000, it was very much frequently revised. And in 2000s, in DMZ area, the demand was frequently made by the South Korean government, and South Korean government in their North Korean policies and policy in the DMZ, there were been rapid changes. And in the U.S. and the UN command, what to do about the UN going forward was also actively discussed. So what I mean by is that the operation control, transfer of the operation control was also discussed during this time, and once the operation control is transferred, then we think there will be no longer a link between the UN military and the South Korean forces. But if you look at the UN command regulations, the UN command had all the US and Korean and UN forces doing operation around Korean Peninsula. Over them, they have the authority to give command and order that is specified in the UN command rules. So the UN command breaking ties with the Korean forces is not the fact. It's actually going through the redefinition, and that is also reflected in the UN command regulations. And UN command regulations also said, and that its own purpose, it states that there are two. First, what is important is that compliance with the armistice agreement, and the talks about the responsibilities of the UN command. And this regulation is for the military operations. It stipulates that, and when it comes to DMZ, it says it's operation zone and operation area. It's defined in that way, meaning that the UN head of the UN command controlling access to the DMZ is done part of its military operations, controlling access to the military theater. So that it's not in violation of the regulation, rather it's justified. And the regulations itself have absolute standing vis-a-vis other regulations. Now, if you look at one example, as the Article 7 and 9 talks of the armistice agreement, talks about access control to the DMZ, and the UN C regulations, it's specified into 5 rules, and talks about how in DMZ management, the UNC regulations is becoming the medium of the armistice agreement to have control over the DMZ. Now, in terms of the access control, in the armistice agreement, clauses or article relate to access control is from Articles 7 to 10. And when it comes to the article related to access control, there could be 2 interpretations. One is that the UN command authority responsibility is interpreted as to be absolute. Another thing is that in the armistice letter, that as was specified there, it's subject and falls under the Armistice Agreement. But for the UNC regulations, rather than the second interpretation, the first one, saying that the UNC command is absolute, it's more supported of that interpretation. So in the UNC regulations, when it comes to access control, the rules and regulations have gone through revisions in 1986. If you look at 551-4, says visitor to EMZ need to apply for visit approval 24 hours ahead. And the constraint at that time, what made Koreans uncomfortable, was that you had to have the personal information be reviewed by the police, which is no longer mandatory. But and it's restricted. Visit is restricted to only those part of the security tour, and if there's reporters that wants to go there, application needs to be made 72 hours ahead. So everything was really specified in detail. Specification in detail has the convenience that you know exactly which ones to comply, but in reality, it ties your movement and freedom. So it's something really to think about. And also, the approval rights is given to the Secretary of the UNC Command, and that means it's not from Korean forces, but a colonel from the U.S. forces. Then, within the DMZ also, rights for the administration management, and in the area where it's under two Korea's governance, where there's a de facto control has been transferred to two Koreas, how it really looks at is that in English it says TC, that area. So it doesn't say it's an area controlled by two Koreas. It just says TC. In other words, it's a special zone created to link up the roads and trains of two Koreas, and it doesn't say that this area specifically governed or managed by two Koreas. So the authority of those controlling the area is that if you go through the military demarcation line, you have to go through a lot of red tapes put by different agencies, so it requires a lot of time. And again, approval needs to be requested 48 hours ahead, and you know, access request needs to be made like 96 hours before, and to the UN command, and there are a lot of red hurdles, even on this area called TC. So we think this is under South and North Korean control, but in reality, it takes a lot of time, a lot of approvals from the UN command. So in terms of militarization of DMZ area in the UN command regulation, it states that the various chains or the blocks there, the barbed wires that's put in there still exist, and in the scenery of DMZ we see a lot of barbed wires, and there are also GPs there, and these RGPs and barbed wire fences are all put in place based on the approval of US and command. And also bringing firearms in there because it was put on a bit later on after the regulation was set forth. Of course, firearms are deployed by the North Korean side around this area, and of course, we need to respond to that. But within DMZ, bringing firearms in that area, very belatedly, related regulations were set up after the fact. So, due to time constraints, I tried to hurry up in my explanations. But in summary, what I want to say is that when it comes to DMZ, the armistice agreement in many areas, it has become invalid. And despite that, some clauses and articles are still very much valid and are being applied in an expanded area, and that is about access control, and the access control to DMZ is under absolute control of the UNC regulations, and UNC regulation has become the absolute rule when it comes to DMZ area, and the UNC regulations are what is applicable in reality to the DMZ area, and it's rules governing the practical operation and management of DMZ area. So UNC command, going beyond the military purposes, it's exerting a lot of control that goes beyond mere military areas. So I think regarding the purpose of this session, the armistice agreement that created DMZ was created, and armistice agreement was created in 1953. And when the armistice agreement was first created, the prime focus was preventing a recurrence of war. So within the discourse of various theories related to passive and active peace, it was all about passive peace. Armistice agreement was also to realize passive peace, and to realize this passive peace, to compensate for armistice agreement, UNC regulations was born. But now in 2020, DMZ is changing, DMZ status is changing, and Korean society is also going through a lot of changes. Hence, new laws and regulations or legal framework is very much in need. So within DMZ, and inside and outside of DMZ, going beyond area where the hostile activities are banned, it needs to serve as the area where really peace is realized from there. So it needs to play more active role in creating peace, and to help that, we need the right legal framework that supports that. And to do that, I'm saying even the UNC regulations is something that we also need to think about revising. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Han, for your presentation on the problems of the current UN command regulations, and also for suggesting legislative alternatives. Now, I'll invite the second speaker, Professor Kim Kwang-soo. Good afternoon. My name is Kim Kwang-soo, teaching law in the Seogang University. So I will make a brief presentation based on the materials in the booklet. So let me explain the legal framework regarding the use and management of the DMZ. Related to the DMZ, there are many diverse discussions regarding climate change, life of the residents in the border area, inter-Korean and international cooperation. I believe, the legal discussion has several meanings. First of all, law is devised based on discussion and agreement, so it is fixed and has clear meaning. And the content of the law is supported by the enforcing power of state. Second, domestic legal discussion leads to legislation based on democratic process, implemented by the administration and interpreted by the judiciary. Therefore, it meets the demand of the Constitution that is democracy and the rule of law. Third, laws are publicly proclaimed. Everybody can have access to it. It forms social order because conservation, development, and use is based on laws. In other words, the legal framework establishes the order of conservation and use of the DMZ. So my presentation today is based on my paper titled The Environmental Laws of the South and North Korea and Ways to Conserve and Use the DMZ. Unlike the academic paper, I will make my presentation more easier to understand for the general public. So the DMZ spans about 10 kilometers into both the south and the north. And it is a symbol of the Korean War and the Cold War in the context of our history. And the DMZ has a lot of cultural heritage, including the remnant of the prehistoric age and the Shilla dynasty. The access is restricted. It also holds value as a treasure of the ecosystem. And as we will take a look at later, many endangered species can be also found in the DMZ. In the social context, with the restricted access of civilians to the border area in the DMZ, the residents are having a lot of economic difficulties. Now let's take a look at the legal structure regarding the DMZ. Now, there is, first of all, the international legal structure regarding the UN Command, as explained by Professor Han previously. So, under the Armistice Agreement of 1953, the DMZ is supposed to prevent any event that may lead to belligerence between the two sides. So, any activity in the DMZ is governed by the Armistice Committee. And there is also the legal framework between the South and the North. As you may well know, the Inter-Korean Joint Communique of 1972 declared the principle of independent and peaceful unification and national unity. In the Basic Agreement of 1991, the two sides agreed to establish a Inter-Korean Military Committee and discuss peaceful use of the DMZ. In the Panmunjom Declaration for Peace, Prosperity, and Unification of 2018, declared that the two sides will stop all hostile activities around the military demarcation line and create a peaceful area in the DMZ. And there's the third legal structure, which is South Korea's domestic structure. There is the Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation Act that stipulates principles for exchange and cooperation between the South and the North. And there is the Development of Inter-Korean Relations Act that stipulates that the inter-Korean relations development should be based on the principles of independence, peace, and democracy, and pursue common prosperity of the South and the North and peaceful unification. And the law also prohibits any act that causes harm to the life and body of people in major danger in the area north of the civilian control line. And now there is the special act on the support for the border area. Stipulates supportive measures for the residents in the border area. And let me introduce a little bit about the environmental laws in North Korea, which is also related to the DMZ. There is the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. In South Korea, there is the Framework Act on the environmental protection. There are chapters, each corresponding to objects of protection. And North Korea has a single comprehensive act on the environmental protection. And the constitutional amendment of 1992 stipulated environmental protection in North Korea, which shows its commitment to environmental protection. And North Korea is actually a member state of several international environmental treaties, including the UN Biodiversity Convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Kyoto Protocol. So I believe this is critical when we discuss environmental commitment of North Korea. So these international fora where countries discuss environmental principles can actually serve as a venue for inter-Korean cooperation on the DMZ. Next, I will take a look at the bill on the conservation and peaceful use of the DMZ, which was submitted recently. So there have been many efforts by the central government, local governments, and NGOs for the conservation and peaceful use of the DMZ, but there was no law to directly support those efforts. But in 2020, a lawmaker of the governing party submitted a bill on the conservation and peaceful use of the DMZ. So the bill stipulates that the key principles would be peace in the DMZ and the common prosperity of the South and the North, development of the border area and cooperation of the border areas of the North and the South, protection of life and safety of people in the DMZ, and provision of convenience, conservation of the environment and historical heritage, and raising public awareness on the value of the DMZ. And the bill also stipulates legal tools to achieve such principles. For example, establishment of plans for peaceful use of the DMZ, the establishment of a committee on the peaceful use of the DMZ, designation of the peaceful use zone, support for safety and entry, and training of expert talents. Some of you might think that this, since this bill was submitted by a member of the governing party, which holds a majority in the National Assembly, it'll be very easy to be passed. But the National Assembly has to go through negotiation process and should be supported by the public for it to be passed and take root institutionally. Now, the DMZ symbolizes a painful moment of our history and is still an unresolved challenge. Now, the legal frameworks regarding the DMZ are multi-layered, including the international, inter-Korean, and domestic legal structures. Meanwhile, the value of the DMZ is growing in terms of culture, history, environment, society, and the economy. And I believe that we need multifaceted cooperation to reduce the pain of the people and realize the value of the DMZ. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kim, about that presentation. Talked about the practical legal framework of DMZ as it stands now, and that through discussion we need to create better base for starting discussion about the DMZ. Especially North Koreans are trying to come up with laws related to environmental protection, and given that it's become more interested in furthering international cooperation in this area, it could become a stimulus to creating more friendly cooperation for the DMZ between two Koreans, and that we need new laws, and we need justification for adopting new laws given the ideological and many differences between two Koreas, and that is a way to gain also public acceptance and consensus. Now we
And concluded that we need to pass the bill in the National Assembly. Now we move on to panel discussion, first by team leader Ryu Ji-sung of the National Unification Legislation Team of the Korean Legislation Research Institute. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. My name is Ryu Ji-sung. I am now at my office in the Korea Legislation Research Institute. It's a great honor for me to join the discussion of renowned speakers. Due to a prior commitment, I couldn't make it to Yanggo, and joining you instead online, I ask for your understanding. So, the discussion in the session is about the legal and institutional framework, and I would like to make some additional comments to Mr. Lee Hyung-chul. First of all, the government is pursuing an international peace zone in the DMZ, which is only possible when we sign a separate inter-Korean agreement. If the efforts are only in the south of the DMZ, it is not necessary. But if we want to work with North Korea in implement the initiative in the entire DMZ, we do need an inter-Korean agreement. Now there are two challenges regarding that. First, the stark difference in the opinions of the governing and the opposition parties. Because of that, it's difficult to gain agreement from the National Assembly. And even if an agreement is passed in the National Assembly, its legal effectiveness can be disputed. So I believe we need both the inter-Korean agreement and a domestic law that supports the agreement. And if the National Assembly supports the inter-Korean agreement, it can be regarded as an international treaty that should be enforced. And let me also talk about introduction of an implementation law. As the previous speaker said, we have to explore whether we can just revise existing laws or introduce a whole new act. In general, revising existing laws is desirable if the stipulation is on similar issues to the ones in the existing laws, and if the stipulation is on whole new issues, we need to establish a new law. So we need to see whether the peaceful use of DMZ applies to which of these two kinds. Now the government is working on attracting international organizations, removing landmines in the DMZ, and establishing more industrial complexes, and so on. And these initiatives cannot be supported fully by revising existing laws. And these initiatives are tools to realize the right to peace and survival for people. So I believe we need a separate law that can gain National Assembly support and public support as well. And at the same time, we can let North Korea and the international society know the commitment of South Korea to peace in the DMZ, and allow the international society to legally participate in these initiatives. And with a new law, we can consolidate the fact that the DMZ belongs to South Korean territory by adding another layer, legal layer, on top of existing laws. Of course, we need to also consider the possibility of potential conflict with North Korea, existing UN command regulations, and so on. Therefore, we have to make sure that a separate law will not exacerbate any situation with North Korea in international legal frameworks. In order to ensure that, we have to establish a inter-Korean joint committee on that. And under that, we can establish an inter-Korean liaison office. Physically, it was exploited, but legally, it can still exist. As it serves mainly the role of providing convenience to personnel working in the DMZ, it can help practically the initiatives like removing landmines, in laying the foundation for attracting international organizations and building industrial complex. For that, we need to allow more personnel, more than the current 20, to work in the liaison office. And also introduce uh, privileges, legal privileges for the personnel, personal guarantee of personal safety of the personnel in the liaison office. Let me go into more details. First of all, regarding registering the DMZ as a world heritage. Now, the South Korean Act on the Historical Cultural Heritage, but it only stipulates the government's obligation to make efforts to maintain cultural, historical, and cultural heritage. So it is insufficient to support the initiatives to register the DMZ as World Heritage. Now, I believe we need a special act that regulates a large area that includes the border area, but it should be considered in relation to the UN Command Regulation and the Armistice Agreement. First of all, it has to deal with appropriation of private land. But the problem here is that we don't have official document that can prove the ownership of the land in the border area. And as a solution to this problem, the government and the owners of the private land have to negotiate for the purchase of the law. And we should also review whether we can regulate the area in the north of the DMZ and discuss this issue with North Korea. And the third issue is attracting international organizations. Now, there is existing act on the support on the attracting international organizations. But this act does not assume that such an organization can be attracted to the DMZ. It only regulates attracting organizations to South Korea. So there is again the need for a new law. So a new law should stipulate cooperation mechanisms with the North, simplification of procedures, in allowing legal privileges to the personnel working for international organizations in the DMZ. The fourth issue is removing landmines. Is to establish an international peace zone in the DMZ, we have to remove landmines. However, domestically, we don't have sufficient legal foundation for that. Now, the law on firearms, and it does not regulate military equipment and weapons, so it cannot regulate the landmines. And there is another act that prohibits civilians to enter the DMZ for any act related to removing landmines. So the restriction should be lifted. Now, there is also another law that can provide the legal ground of allowing civilians to take part in landmine removal. In considering the international organization's call to participate in the landmine removal activities, we have to allow civilians to participate in such activities. So these has been the cases in the Cambodia, Laos, and other countries. in partnership with international organizations. So I think we can also think about partnership with international organizations and NGOs. And regarding that, we can also consider the Landmine Treaty. Now, there are more than 100 member states. If the North and the South can join this treaty simultaneously, it can provide a strong rationale for the international community to provide support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, about legislations, clash between domestic and international laws is the topic that he talked about. There have been some questions, so maybe Mr. Lee, you could prepare your answers. Now I'd like to ask Director Kim In-ho to talk from more practical and more policy perspective about this issue. Thank you. For experts, thank you for in-depth presentations. Now about I'm not a legal expert, but as a public servant, I will focus on what I felt in terms of the administration and from practical perspective. The topic of this forum is, climate change. DMZ in the era of climate change and the climate change crisis. What can it serve toward achieving peace between two Koreas? I think it opens a new window of opportunities, and this discussion is now possible because up to now the military tension between South and North Korea have eased, and based on such new environment, discussion started to also take more advantage and utilize more DMZ. And overall, we are divided countries, and that switching to the era of peace, this is the inevitable stepping phase we need to go through, having all these discussions. Now, in the Panmunjom Declaration of April and military agreement in September, do discuss about joint project between South and North Korea, doing a survey of the DMZ area and also excavating remains in DMZ area have all been discussed. And they also talked about removing GPs and also, opening up the DMZ for more public access. And that resulted in higher public expectation. And DMZ is serving as the military buffer zone. How to interpret that? DMZ basically do exist as a military buffer zone. And we are not denying that. We are respecting such function, but we want to have more reasonable usage out of DMZ. So based on two Korea's agreement in environment, culture, and other areas, not in other words, in non-military areas, there has been activity to utilize DMZ between two Koreas. Of course, the caveat is that we have support from the UN, and we can even discuss this because there has been progress made between South and North Korean relations. The basic standing of Korean government is that currently the UN we don't want to damage the buffer zone role of DMZ. We want to keep that alive, but the rights over our territory should at the same time be executed. JSA demilitarization or removing GP through practical approach. There have been government aim to remove any potential accidental clashes between two militaries, and removing mines and you know identifying remains in the DMZ. We want, through that effort, we want to turn DMZ as irreversible peace zone. And due to military tension in this area, the area was slow in terms of development. So for the border regions, by turning DMZ into peace area, they can gain momentum for their own regional development and make the peace part of their everyday life. And legal aspects have already been discussed. But if I may add, there are laws governing DMZ. It's a military protection law, and there's also UNC regulations. But there's no law that comprehensively talks about DMZ. So setting the principle for peace maintenance in DMZ, and also environmental, culture, historical, and military functions or aspects of DMZ could be all overhauled and go under some framework acts that governs everything. And by legislating these types of laws, of course, we need to take consideration of two Korea's relations, and in creating the peace and in aiming for reunification. What could DMZ its role could be is something that we need to think about, because it's an important area. It has its own special uniqueness, and that needs to be all imbued in the legislation. And that's why Ministry of Unification is identified as the owner of this legislation process. And once we have acts about this, it shows there's some legislative framework governing the two Korea relations, and it could also help us gain more support from the international communities. I mean, creating the legal framework is the base, and that would, once it becomes an act or law, even if there's a government change, there would be consistency, and there will be no lack of interest just because the government has changed. And when it becomes a project or policy, intergovernmental coordination is necessary, because on the culture, military, environment areas, urban development, there are different aspects, and different agencies and ministries argue to have their voices and rights reflected, interests reflected. So there could be some overlaps or similar project, and if they go by themselves, it becomes disorienting, and it could just become a one-off project. So to avoid that, set the mid to long-term policy direction, and based on such a long-term policy agenda, we can use that to coordinate different interests and efforts of different regions. And this is all because we value DMZ so much. And through legislation, that it could serve as the justification for engaging in DMZ-related projects. Now, to go into DMZ area, there are different hurdles you need to jump through, get some different approvals. So it's not easy, it takes time. But once you have the legal base, the budget securing for the project will become more coherent, and in persuading the public, and in talking with the UNC, we could have more firm righteous base. And the law proposed last October by the current Minister of Public Administration being reviewed by National Assembly. So we are continuing discussing this with other ministries, and we are exerting our support to turn this into a law. And so it's being a bit delayed, but I hope that it really becomes a law within this year, so that the utilization of DMZ can really happen based on a very more stable ground. And look forward to your continued interest, so that this can really become a law. And I hope that it becomes a public discourse. Whether it's executable law or whether it's enforceable, that's the second question. The first thing is we do what needs to be done, and it's also more important that we have the commitment to push through with it. So response or support from the North Korea is something that we need to draw from North Korea and clash with UN command and how it's received by international community. Something that as a challenges we need to overcome. And with that, I would like to end my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Kim, for your discussion. So you emphasized the need for a law for conservation and use of the DMZ. Of course, legislating a new law can be challenging, but for us to ensure effectiveness, it is necessary. So we have a few minutes remaining, and we have to take some questions from the floor. Now we have an international promise to wrap up the session by 3 o'clock. So I'm going to give each speaker about 1 minute for closing. We'll start with Mr. Lee Hyung-chul first.
Yes, I think that was all valid points by our panelists. Now, inter-Korean cooperation was mentioned in 2000 and 2002 DMZ area, based on, when we used that area at the time. And for the DMZ to be used in the current status quo, we need agreement between not only two Koreas, but also with the UN command. That is the only way to use practically in the use DMZ. So just agreement between South and North Korea is not enough to execute or enforce the laws. So for the laws to become valid, there are a lot of different consultation process with North Korea and with the UN, other countries that are necessary. So timing-wise, is it really possible? Yes, there is a skepticism, which is quite valid, because this is such an important issue and something that we really need to think about. But at the same time, including DMZ, the Han River Estuary Basin, our legal jurisdiction, exerting our national rights is also important. So maybe we need to cautiously but still push ahead with this thing. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for inviting me to this important forum. I learned a lot today. During the lunch break, I tasted the liver and a part of the pork, and I thought of my late father who fought in the war in one of the historic sites of the Korean War. There are many tombs and epitaphs. They symbolizes visually the pain and suffering of the war. And today we discussed a lot about inter-Korean domestic and international legal structures for the peaceful use of the DMZ. And I think in the morning we talked about the Korean DNA. I think it's all about having a lot of fun, being emotional, and so on. I think it can be good for us, but for us to uh, put aside the past and take a step forward to the future, it can be sometimes problematic. I hope we can be more reasonable and rational uh, in terms of responding to neighboring powers, and that is necessary more than ever. Thank you very much, Professor Han.
If I may say again, the UNC regulations, it's not only just simple medium to apply the arms agreement to DMZ, but reversely, it even regulates the armistice agreement and constrains revision of the said agreement. And that's why I'm really struggling with this issue of UNC regulations. But what is fortunate is that UNC regulation can be changed. It can be subject to revision. While preparing for my paper last year, I actually looked up all the UNC regulations. Of course, there are some areas that I need to check further. And while also preparing for this forum, in just 1 year, uh, it's been 1 year since I last looked at it. So looked at whether there was further revision, and it was not revised in the last 1 year. But there are different types of UNC regulations, and depending on situation, the relation to policies of DMZ, Korean Peninsula, Korea, and also international relations, it has always been changed and revised. So further amendment is possible. So I hope that this regulations can be overhauled and go through wide range of changes. And even if UN command is a part of the picture, I hope still allows that Korean government to play more wider role, become a practical guardian and supervisor of DMZ in culture and other areas governing over DMZ. To that purpose, UNC regulation can be changed, as well as we can adopt laws for that purpose.
Thank you very much. We have spent all the time given to the session, so it was very difficult to discuss all the diverse issues in this limited time. But at least I think we have a common understanding that we need legislative uh, initiatives to overcome the challenges regarding the use of the DMZ. If we can take steps forward in the legislation to overcome the remaining challenges, I believe it is in particular important for us to reinforce our sovereign control in the DMZ, as well as achieving peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. I'd like to thank the speakers and panelists for their presentations and discussion. Thank you. A big round of applause, please. I'd like to thank Director Park, Professor Han, Professor Kim, Mr. Lee, Team Leader Ryu, and Director Kim for their contribution. After a short break, we'll move on to the next session. Session 2 and Session 3 will start from 3:10 in two different venues. Session 2, under the theme of Sustainable Environmental and Cultural Cooperation in the DMZ, will be held here in this venue. And in Session 3, under the theme of DMZ, the New Perception and Approach in Security Communities Ways, will be held on the second floor. Please come back by 3:10.